Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Indie Insight, the show that helps to bring journalists, developers, and creators all together to talk about the one medium we all know and love. I'm your host, Odhrán Johnson, and in today's episode, I'm joined by the wonderful David Szymanski. David is an independent developer working with New Blood Interactive and has worked on everything from psychological horror titles like Finger Bones and the Moonsliver to the critically acclaimed boomer shooter DUSK, and currently he's working on a plethora of projects which include the upcoming New Blood Thief-inspired title Gloomwood and the self-described action puzzle D-make Dusk 82. David, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Yeah, I've rattled off a few of your games there, but I still even haven't gotten to, I suppose, the meat of everything yet. But I kind of like to start off the first question, and I know you've answered it to death in a few other interviews before, but kind of what initially was the beginning of your game development career, I want to say, but also your passion and love for it?
Let's see. That's gonna go way back. So the first game that I, excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold. Um, takes me like now that I'm in my 30s, it takes me like a week or more to actually get over having a cold. So the first game that I can remember really being kind of like infatuated with as more than just a like, fun distraction, was Myst. And I actually have a bunch of Myst posters on my wall right now. I've continued to be in love with Myst, but yeah, it was I don't know, just something about the world and the atmosphere grabbed me, even though it like terrified. Like I was like, to me, Myst was like a horror game. I was a kid at this point. So I remember finding there's one part where you find a secret room and there's like there's this like rotting skull hidden in a box, which isn't that much of anything, but as a kid, like, that scared the crap out of me, and I didn't go back to playing the game for like weeks. I like shut it off and went and hid or whatever. But that's the first thing I can remember really being like kind of a little obsessed with. And along with that, after a while, at least, I remember talking about it with a friend at school who she had the game also, and we'd like talk about it. And along with kind of being into this game, after a while came this idea that I was like, wait a second, I know from it came with this video called like The Making of Myst or something on the CD. It's like, and I of course watched that, and I was like, well, I know from that they mentioned that they used this program called HyperCard to make Myst. And in elementary school, we were learning a program called Hyper Studio, which is essentially the same thing. These are both earlier presentation software, sort of like PowerPoint. Myst is essentially just a whole bunch of slides strung together in this PowerPoint-esque program. And I just remember realizing suddenly, I'm like, wait a second, I could do something like that. Because we were learning this in computer class. Do kids still have computer class? I wonder if that's even still a thing. But we had computer class, where we all went to the computer lab and all sat and did our Hyper Studio projects. And so I did. I went and made this little Myst style, well, kind of Myst style. It was not very good, I remember. Sadly, it's been lost to time, but I made this little Myst style game, and that is what basically started my journey into becoming a game developer, because after that, my dad just randomly was like, there's this software called QBasic that I learned in college that you can program with, and he had this old textbook that I taught myself QBasic from, and then after a few years was good enough and I guess mentally developed enough to be able to make some little ASCII art games, which are still available to play. Actually, they're going to get shipped with Dusk 82 whenever we ship that for PC, just for free, just for posterity's sake. And then that led into, well, I made those, I released them online, nobody played them because they're ASCII QBasic games, so of course nobody played them. This is long, long before there was anything resembling like an indie market. This is back in
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't remember when, mid 2000s. Um, and so, I kind of drifted away from that. I pursued more like writing and music. Tried to do a few more other things in QBasic that just never got off the ground. One of those, most relevantly, was I was trying to develop an FPS because I fell in love around this point. This is when I was a young teenager. I fell in love with first-person shooters. Um, and this would be about around the time that, like, I remember Halo 2 was a big thing that
Mm-hmm.
I played at a friend's house. Half-Life 2, Doom 3, all of these games were out. Um, I did not have a computer that would play anything close to those games. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I was playing. Well, I didn't have a computer that would play those. I also didn't have money to buy a game. To buy games, I had a pretty small allowance, and I didn't work at that point. I was still a young teenager. Um, and technically, I wasn't really allowed to be playing super violent games. It was kind of loose. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually, after a few years, that was lifted because my parents were just like, it's fine. So basically, I was downloading shareware of like Doom and Duke Nukem 3D and Quake and Chasm and all of these things, and I was playing it. And that got me in the same way I'd kind of been obsessed with Myst. I kind of became obsessed with those sort of games, and I just really wanted to play something like, or really wanted to make something like Quake and Chasm, and I tried to do that in QBasic. I tried to learn how to write my own 3D engine and make it in QBasic. Now, that just does not happen in QBasic. It's not a very powerful language. There were a couple first-person shooters people had made in it. One of them it was like the crisis of QBasic programming. It was called MUX, and it was like this Wolfenstein 3D clone that ran at, I don't know, 5 FPS or something, and they'd only been able to achieve it by having like part of it be in C or something like that. Um, so I didn't succeed at doing that. But the game that I was trying to make was DUSK. That
Mm-hmm.
is back when I was a teenager. I designed and named DUSK, which then becomes relevant years in the future. Anyway, big long rabbit trail. That's all to say. None of this stuff really worked out. It wasn't that. I didn't. Not that many people played anything I did. I kind of drifted away from it into more doing music and doing writing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we get to about college time, and I'm going to college for music composition. And one of the things I'm most excited about going to college is, I guess sadly enough, that I was going to have a dorm computer, and that dorm computer was powerful enough to run Half-Life 2, which
Mm-hmm.
is a game that I had desperately wanted to play for years. This is like 2008, 2009. Um, we still did not have a computer that was anywhere close to being able to run that sort of thing. So I go to college, I play Half-Life 2, I start playing all of these games that I'd heard of while I was back as a teenager and never been able to play. Finally get to play them, and I also at the same time learn about Game Maker,
Mm-hmm.
which is a much more powerful tool than QBasic was. Um, and so I get Game Maker, and I make a few games with those, upload them to Yo-Yo Games. Those do somewhat better than stuff I'd ever done in QBasic, which is to say, still basically nobody played them, but a few people played them, and there were reviews for them, and I guess more importantly, I was enjoying making them, so I kept doing that. Um, Really continued to work in Game Maker off and on throughout college and into my adult life. I finished college. Uh, I did not use my degree because you don't really make a living as a composer. I mean, you can obviously, but um, I'm I think at this point I'm working at a car wash part time. My wife is also working at the car wash. Um, and I'm at this point making kind of first person games in Game Maker. Um, and that's when I learned about Unity.
Mm-hmm.
And I get Unity. I'm big fan. I am still a very big fan of doing things as cheaply or just completely free as possible. For instance, I've never touched Photoshop. Even now, I just use GIMP. I use Audacity for all my basic sound work needs. And at that point, I was even more on the train of wanting to do free stuff. So Unity, free engine, I'm going to grab that. I'd experimented a little bit with some other pre-Unity engines that were out there. I remember one that I really wanted to use but couldn't was called JMonkey, and I couldn't use it because it wouldn't run on my computer, because even at that point, I just did not have I think this was before a little bit before graduating college, when I'd switched colleges and was back at home. But anyway, so I got Unity and decided to learn Unity. I was going to make a game, because I don't really learn stuff and then make games. I learn by doing. And so that game was Fingerbones. That is the game that I made to learn Unity, basically. Which I believe now that's believe it or not, a summarized version of my early. So that covers about up to the point where anybody really cares about anything I've made.
Oh, yeah, with it's really interesting, because when I look at your previous work, obviously I don't know if you've interacted with people that have kind of come to see your work maybe around that Fingerbones, the Moonsliver era, and then kind of there's a contrast between them and then those who have come to know your work through DUSK, because they are two quite...
Yeah, there's some that have stuck through the entire way, which is kind of insane to me.
But it's like, they're both kind of, you could say they kind of operate in the same realm or same sort of aesthetic, but they're obviously two very different genres and two very different gameplay experiences. Is it, I don't know, is it strange in a sense to you for, like, because whenever I look at, say, a game developer or whatever, and it's obviously very different for the indie market, to go from, say, your almost, I say walking sim, but almost psychological horror, learn as you go sort of walking simulators, to then this open-ended, big style boomer shooter that, blew up, whatever. How did was it a general, because I know you talked a bit before, I was on, I believe it was on the Doom Eternal unofficial podcast, which is run by Under the Mayo, the Spud Hunter, and P&D Ketchup. You talked a bit about getting burnt out after, I think it might have been after The Wolf in Autumn, but
yeah,
there was the general sense of the burnout, was it that you wanted then to move away from that style of game, or was it more so just, not that you wanted to move away, but it just happened to coincide that your burnout happened when you went to start going a bit more into DUSK era?
So if you look, like what I was saying before, there was, when I was a kid, infatuated with Myst. As a teenager, infatuated with shooters. I think the real other kind of milestones between that and between when I started, Fingerbones and stuff, would be probably Half-Life 2 and Stalker. So those I would say are the main milestones getting to this point of games that not my favorite games, but games that had the biggest influence on me thinking about creating games. And if you look at that, it's, Myst. That's kind of similar to the horror games that I made in a lot of ways. Then you get to shooters, which is obviously DUSK. So, when I decided... So, Fingerbones was actually quite different from the games I'd made before that also. It's just no one had played those games. So, it looks like my starting point was with Fingerbones and the Moonsliver and all those sort of games, which are very Myst-like atmosphere, horror-themed, but they're focused a lot more on, subtle horror and atmosphere and, that sort of creepiness, which I have always associated with Myst. But that was like a departure from what I'd done previously. So I think I've always kind of bounced around between these seemingly disparate things. So when I did Fingerbones and all those games, it was done in a very short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Because I did Fingerbones, it did insanely well for, compared to anything else I'd done at that point. So I immediately wanted to jump on that and make something similar that was for money, because I wanted to make money doing this.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that was the Moon Sliver, and it did make money. It actually made enough money that I felt comfortable quitting my job at that point, which was working as a checkout person at Dollar General, which absolutely sucks, by the way. Do not work for Dollar General. They are a garbage company. But so that made money, and so that making money then fueled me. Making money and doing fairly well fueled me into being like, I can do better than this. I know I can do better. That like I've accumulated all this knowledge now from two different games.
Mm-hmm.
And I put all of that energy into the Music Machine, which was bigger and better in pretty much every way. Um, but that did not make as much money. It did better as far as reviews go, and I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people looking back would say that's their favorite of those
Mm-hmm.
games. At least that's what I usually hear. Um, but the lightning of sales did not strike twice. I was very lucky with the Moon Sliver. It just happened to drop in the right way at the right time, to do what at that point was a like insanely well for me. Um, so the Moon Sliver, or the Music Machine, not doing well. It sold. It did okay, but it was like, oh, this is this is not like never have to work again money at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that created a sort of panic in a way, where it's like, I need to make another game, because this is just like, this didn't sell that well and sales are kind of dipping. Well, I've got to go and do another one. So I very quickly did a Wolf in Autumn. Um, so and this was all, like I said, in a very short period of time. I think it was in total about a year. So
Mm-hmm.
that's 4 different games in a year, maybe a little more than a year. Um, and it was a short period of time with a lot of highs and lows. Um, and when I got to actually releasing A Wolf in Autumn, I was not just exhausted from working so hard but I was also exhausted from releasing that many games and dealing with all of the stresses that come from releasing games,
Mm-hmm.
like, right in a row. I was sick and tired of dealing with, reviews. I was sick of seeing, to be, to be completely honest, I was sick of seeing other games come out and do better when I, at that point, did not feel they deserved to do better. This
Mm-hmm.
was kind of during maybe not the height, but the point before the drop off of indie horror popularity on YouTube, um, which it was for that time in 2015, 2014, 2015. It was like the hot thing to let's play on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you'd see these games going around. I'm not going to name any names now, because some of these people now I'm even friends with and have worked with and have much more respect for, because I've gotten over myself. But at that time, it was like, these games are garbage, and I think what I'm doing is much better, and I can't get I can't get anyone to play them. I can't get Markiplier to pay any attention to them, which is what I really wanted, so that hopefully that would generate more sales, which may not have, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
uh, all of this kind of contributed to me feeling burnt out. And also, yeah, I'd done 4 games pretty much in the exact same style, and I was kind of bored of it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, Wolf in Autumn came out. It did even worse than the Music Machine, but it was still making money, and I felt like it would be okay to take a bit of a break. Oh, I'd also worked on The Grandfather during that point, which doesn't get brought up very often, because I wasn't really a designer on it at all. I was basically a developer for hire.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that also took up a lot of time, like a lot of time and energy. Um, so I thought I'd take some time off and I would just prototype and do whatever I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that, and yes, eventually DUSK came out of that, after a few other prototypes that didn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, even, do you find it almost weird in a sense when people kind of look at your work and it's always very focused on Dusk? Because, well, obviously that would be the case given that it is your standout game and you did immensely well, both sales-wise and critically and commercially acclaimed. When you kind of actually delve a little bit deeper, there is a weird sort of I wouldn't say weird, it's definitely not weird, but there is a niche sort of fan base for your older stuff as well, whether it be that group of say Fingerbones, Moonsliver, Music Machine, and so on and so forth. I think even during my research for this interview, there was a number of videos. Even I think there's even at least one or two video essays delving into the work you've done in the horror, psychological horror sphere. So do you, I don't know, you mentioned that the Music Machine is one that's particularly a favorite to a lot of people you've talked to. Do you have a particular favorite out of those ones you've worked on?
Probably the Music Machine. That's the one that I'm most proud of in hindsight. I've kind of distanced myself from Fingerbones because there's a lot about it that I fundamentally don't like. Like the way it's written, or even the kind of artistic concept behind it, I'm just kind of not on board with anymore. The Moonsliver, it's hard not to just see flaws in these things, but I think the Music Machine is the one where going back, I'm like, wow, that still is a really cool aesthetic. I'm still proud of some of this music I wrote for it. I still think, while the narrative has some really clunky, weird moments, it also has some moments I still think hit fairly well. Yeah, I think that's probably my favorite one.
Yeah. I know I've heard you mention in interviews before that, and this is going to tie into these older games that you worked on, but you mentioned when first initially working on Dusk, one of the more important parts for you was getting the aesthetic right, or the look of a game right, before actually delving into actually doing the gameplay elements of it. Is that similar? Is that a similar sort of feeling for when you did stuff like the Moonsliver and when you did the Music Machine? And then on top of that, when you look at, say, how important narrative is in those initial games that you created, does that take precedent over the look, or is the look still the number one key feature and then everything else comes after that?
Well, every game that I have done and released so far always started... Well, I should say every game since at least Fingerbones. I don't remember how development went of like a lot of the older ones, but everyone since Fingerbones always started with visuals. It seems like that's how I operate. If I start a project getting a visual style down, usually that gets more traction than starting at other points for me creatively. But as far as which one rules the other, I think that's kind of hard to say because they all kind of everything gets kind of developed at once. Like I have a very iterative and kind of through developed process where, like, speaking of the Music Machine, making the Music Machine, like, playing, as I was playing around with the aesthetic, and it went through a lot of changes at the beginning. Like, I spent a lot of time playing with just what sort of art style do I want to do for my next game. At the same time I'm playing with that, I'm also thinking about, well, what's happening in this world, and what sort of interaction do I want the player to have with this world, and it's like all happening at the same time, and it all influences each other. So the whole, the soundtrack, for instance, is influenced by just the feel that I want it to have, which is influenced by the art that I've experimented with that I'm like, oh, this seems like a good direction. And that all, of course, is going to influence how the story feels and what the tone is of that. The Music Machine is less like dark horror and more like sort of cosmic melancholy. And that was all, just that's just how it happened. All this stuff kind of happens and influences each other, and it's in some ways you're driving the bus, but the bus isn't entirely under your control. It kind of has this ideas of its own, what it's doing, just kind of based on what ideas you're coming up with and what ones end up sticking, and how you then are like, well, I have this idea and I have this idea, and this is the natural way they fit together, so that's going to now influence what the whole is.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned it's kind of cosmic. There is that sort of, especially for the Music Machine, there's that almost less so horrifying, more so paranormal element, I would kind of say.
Yeah.
Is it, when you're writing, say, something like The Moon Sliver or The Music Machine or A Wolf in Autumn, is there a specific philosophy you have behind writing horror, or is it kind of just they'll kind of take their own shape based on how you're working on it at the time?
Well, almost all of those specific ones were influenced by the idea that I was really into at the time, and still am into, but especially that it was like the driving force was this idea of I really wanted to do horror where you got the most out of very little material.
Mm-hmm.
Like, instead of... I'm still not a big fan of, like, a game or a movie or anything where the scare part is just that, like, something leaps at your screen and this non-diegetic, like, stinger ear... I don't know what language we can use on this, but this non-diegetic
Feel free, go whatever.
like, aural explosion happens and it's scaring you just by like visual and audio overload and startling you. I'm just not a fan of that, and I wasn't a fan of that then either. I played the game Scratches, which is an old point and click horror adventure from like I think 2006 or so. And I was just, well, Scratches does have scares. There are a few that are like that, but it did so much with so little. It built like this atmosphere out of kind of just sinister implications and kind of leaving those to stew and leaving your imagination to work. And I loved that, and I wanted to do something like that. And so all four of those games are influenced by that idea, where it's like I wanted to, I didn't want to just have stuff jumping at the screen, which would be really easy to do. But it's like I wanted to have these moments, set up these specific moments. I guess probably the best example of this is the ending of the Moon Sliver, where it's like the entire game is just setting up that ending, that event at the end, which has no stinger to it. It's just you turn around and there's a thing there, which I think actually ended up working very well. I've had a lot of people comment that was a cool moment for them. So that was the main philosophy governing all of that. As far as how the stories went, really just connecting things together until what I thought was a cool narrative emerged in my head. Narrative of the Music Machine changed a bunch during like workshopping, as I'm sure it does for anyone writing anything. But yeah, it was always just I wanted to do something that was like deeper horror in terms of like what the underlying symbolism and philosophy and stuff, but very specifically horror that's like getting under your skin and creeping you out, and it's scaring you without resorting to the really easy sort of baseline like solution to that, which in the years since, it's like I've loosened up a little bit. Like I understand for one thing, I understand that there's so many different ways to scare people, and so many people are affected by different things. There's no like one answer to what is a good, what's a good scary game and what's a bad scary game. But second of all, so I've kind of come to the realization that like, although I think I get, people will label me as a horror developer, and I have made a lot of horror games, I'm not quite a horror developer. At least in the same, I know people like Airdorf, who's working with New Blood, and I've actually been friends with him since before either of us were professional devs, ironically enough. But, that's a guy that's a horror developer. I don't know, there's just like, there's this focus with like him or like Puppet Combo or these bigger indie horror developers. There's like this focus and appreciation for just pure, scaring people that I don't think I have. like, and you'll see this if you playing the Music Machine, where it's like so much of that game is focused on like the characters and the overarching lore and all this stuff and like the interesting world and things.
Mm-hmm.
Which probably is a strength in a way, but also like if you sat someone down with Faith and you sat someone down with the Music Machine, which one is going to scare them more? Probably Faith. And it's just because, like, when I'm designing these things, I don't have that really driven hyper focus on, like, I want to, everything's scary, everything, I want to make everything as scary as possible. It's like I'm creatively going into so many other different directions that, I think when it comes down to it, it's like I am a horror developer in that I've made games that I label as horror games, but if you were to, I'm not sure anyone would ever list my games as being the scariest thing they've ever played. Maybe they would. I mean, that would be cool. But, I think there's just a little bit of a difference in, like, the intensity of focus on the craft between me and other indie horror developers.
Yeah. No, I think you touch on a really good note, because when it comes to horror, it's always really interesting to, I think, particularly whenever I think of these sort of horror titles that aren't, as you would describe as, the traditional sort of horror, like jump out scare you, like, Halloween, all those sorts of other things. You think of stuff like, I don't know, one that pops to mind very much is Control by Remedy. You always think of, like, it's not exactly a horror game, but it has, sort of spooky implications, paranormal stuff. Things like the X-Files. SCP is another fantastic example of that sort of stuff as well. That's very much, it's almost like a tell, don't show. It's like, okay, I'm reading about this and it sounds really spooky, but I haven't seen it. So, like, it's up to your imagination how horrifying it is. I think the Moonsliver does a really good job at creating a really horrifying atmosphere, more so than it is an actual a scary title. Like, is the implications of what you're doing in the Moonsliver is like, even if you succeed and you get the Moonsliver back, it's like you're still stranded on this desolate island with like nothing to do, and it's just like, it's really like, it brings up that question. It's like, if the world is so bad, like, is it even worth living in it at that stage? Like, I think that sort of horror, like the sort of the dread of the existential crisis of the world, like that sort of stuff, the more, not that anything like Faith or anything isn't a deeper meaning horror title or whatnot, but I think, at least with yours, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least the horror elements I get from your stuff is it's more so designed to have the player thinking about the horror afterwards and kind of what the implications of were that horror, rather than saying, oh, do you remember when I got scared at like this jump scare in Outlast or something like that.
Yeah, and there's like, I'm very focused on atmosphere and the feel of things. I think about this a lot also when it comes to my writing, which I have in the past written, stories and even a little novel that I published, which is completely batshit insane, by the way. It's called Monkey Aladdin. Look it up. It's just. But anyway, like, I think, the really good writers have this interest in people that I'm not sure I have. I've always had this real interest in places and the feel of places. And so, yeah, they're like, the main focus I've always had in these games is like thinking about the feel of the place you're in, and like, the creepiness of you being alone in this place and hearing like the wind whistling past and it being like, there's nobody here now, but there were a little while ago. What happened to them? And yeah, and like the atmosphere is kind of the main focus. And then, that was always the starting point. Well, not really the starting point, but that was always sort of like the easiest thing that would come, is thinking of the atmosphere I wanted. And then in filling in the story with this stuff, I usually ended up, focusing a lot on like tackling philosophical questions I'd have, or just kind of trying to portray things that confused me about, life in different ways, things like that. Those would end up getting portrayed in the story, which then you end up with a story that it's like, it's a lot of sort of symbolic philosophical musings with a cool atmosphere, but maybe not as much big scares.
Yeah, for sure. I want to move on a little bit now and talk a little bit about Dusk. And I think before you kind of really can jump into Dusk, I kind of want to talk a little bit about your involvement with New Blood. Initially, kind of where did you first? I know the story behind how kind of Dusk got picked up by New Blood and all this, but how did you meet? How did you hear of Dave Oshry to begin with, and kind of was that somewhat like how did you hear about him?
Well, now we start getting into the other side of me, I guess, because you have the dreary thinks too hard or overthinks things like artsy guy, which comes through in all of those games, and then you've got this line, and then Dusk happens, and this is in a way this question is the very beginning of like the first step on the journey of crossing the line, which is that. Okay, in 2013, a game called Rise of the Triad came out. It was a reboot, or remake, rather, of a game from the... Was it 95 was Rise of the Triad? I think it was 95. Called Rise of the Triad, which is an insane game by Tom Hall, who is an insane man. And it got remade by Interceptor Entertainment. And I... have always been a fan of these sort of games. I was absolutely overjoyed when I heard there was a Rise of the Triad remake. I bought it day one. I played it. It was incredibly janky, almost unplayable in some areas, but I absolutely loved it. Probably in part because of the jank, because I am a jank connoisseur. I don't know why this is. This extends to a bunch of different parts of my life, not just video games, where, like, stuff that is sort of in bad taste or flawed, or people, too, that have flaws or quirks or rough edges or in bad taste and stuff, I am, like, drawn to those sort of things. So, janky games is something that I'm just drawn to, and I loved the Rise of the Triad remake. Some people did not love the Rise of the Triad remake. It got middling reviews, but it sold very well, in part because this was 2013, and Steam in 2013 was basically a guarantee that your game was going to sell well, because almost nothing was on Steam. Widely used distribution service, almost no indie games. You put your janky reboot on Steam before Steam has reviews, it's going to sell super well, and it did sell super well. And the person who produced and promoted the Rise of the Triad 2013 Super Jank reboot was Dave Oshry. I did not know this at the time. I ended up learning about Dave through Twitter, because of course I did, because it's Dave on Twitter. I didn't even really know who he was. I just knew he was like this personality that occasionally you saw people retweeting. And I saw that he worked on Rise of the Triad. This is now when I'm working on Dusk, and I'm thinking, how am I going to get people to even know about this game and interested in this game? So, on a whim, I just sent him a build of Dusk. Because I was like, oh, guy who worked on Rise of the Triad, I like that game, send him Dusk. One of the most important things that's ever happened to me in my life started by my inexplicable love of broken janky games.
That's not exactly how I was ever imagining that story to have begun. It's strange in a sense because, as you mentioned, like, Dave is a very big personality on Twitter when it comes to a lot of stuff. I think you've almost established yourself as yourself as a personality on Twitter as well. Whether it's, the Doom 3 shotgun or bashing on Fallout's New Vegas, it's just... How much of it actually...
Dave's collection of memes is way better, though, because he's had, like, memes stolen by the Anne Frank Institute and stuff. So.
Oh, my God. When it comes to... it's a really interesting question, because, we talk about Dusk's success, and obviously, inevitably, a large portion of it has to do with, I think you'd agree, a level of luck that just happened to be in the market at the stage where these sort of retro games were just starting to really grow, and I suppose Dusk was one of the very beginning few that managed to strike a chord with a lot of people. How much in part do you think that is down to sort of, I suppose, the weird and wacky marketing that, like, yourself and Dave do for these games on Twitter and so forth?
Well, I think a lot about Dusk doing well was just the stars aligning perfectly.
Hmm.
A big part of it is that when I was developing, it's so crazy to say now because in just a short number of years now we've got retro, boomer shooter throwbacks just from every orifice, basically. But when I was working on Dusk, there weren't any. Like, there was Rack had come out a few years earlier, the Rise of the Triad reboot, and there was Strafe had its Kickstarter and was going to come out. And there may be some other ones, like, kind of under the radar, but it's like, those are the only ones I remember, and I was in the market for these games.
Yeah.
So, when Doom 2016 then happened, and it was a huge hit, and that happened right before we were prepping to announce Dusk. I think it was within a few months that then we announced Dusk. And Doom 2016 was like, it was this, like I said, it was this big hit, but it got like, I think a lot of people suddenly interested in this style of game who didn't care about it before. And then right on the heels of that, we've got Dusk being announced.
Yeah.
Which is, it was a new thing, like the idea of making a game that looked like Quake and releasing it in it was going to be, 26, I think that was around 2016. And so a bunch of people gravitated toward it who were like interested in the idea because it seemed new, or people who had wanted a game like this, like me, for a while. And it just came at the perfect time, basically. If Dusk were to release today, it wouldn't do nearly as well because there's already a bunch of games like that. But at that time, it was like Dusk and Strafe were the two ones. I'm not going to talk much about Strafe, but Strafe's release helped set up Dusk also, let's say, for a lot of people who were looking for something in that something else in that style to play. So that was all kind of just down to lucky timing. Now, the part of this that is not luck is that Dave, who has many faults, is a absolutely brilliant salesman. He makes it look like it's just accidental, and then he's just this stupid, dumb, goofy guy memeing it up, and stuff just works out. Some of which is true, but he's also just very, very good at selling things. Very good at selling things. And so having him behind Dusk, being able to sell this game that a bunch of people already wanted, is just making it do that much better. I've always had a very sort of like irreverent, weird, random sense of humor, so we're very compatible in that way of how, we wanted to portray everything. So me, doing stuff like, oh, haha, you go out of bounds, and, all this silliness, which I just thought, was funny. He'd then see it, and his brain's immediately like, this is something I can use to sell the game. And so he'd put it on Twitter, and it'd do great, and people would see it, or he'd, turn this into, like, a much bigger marketing thing than I ever thought it would be. So a lot of it is down to that. I did my part, too, and still do my part also, of being the other personality behind Dusk. I can be a salesman, but I'm not a very good one. And so basically I have just followed behind whatever Dave's doing to promote the game, being like, okay, I understand what you're doing here. I'll try and do whatever I can to kind of bolster that. And I think those things were kind of the main... Well, I guess the other contributing factor is that I've been told Dusk is a pretty good game, which does help. And so those were really the three pillars of why Dusk ended up doing so well, I think. It's just that really lucky timing, having a really strong marketing, strong and creative marketing presence behind it, and then having it live up to everyone's expectations.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because whenever I talk about Dusk to people, like, Dusk is one of the beginning titles that very much got me into indie games. And because at the time when I got, because I never had a PC up until earlier this year, so I was playing stuff on my laptop. So Dusk runs fine on a laptop, which is great. And as does a lot of indie stuff, which you later find out, but that's here nor there. And trying to navigate the intricacies of Steam and everything else, like from a beginner's perspective, can be quite daunting. So I initially heard about Dusk through Under the Mayo's channel when he did a video on it. And I remember seeing about that, and then obviously I saw like CV11's videos on it and everything, and you go down that rabbit hole afterwards. And I saw a tweet that kind of very much I could see myself tweeting at you, but also at the same time I imagine there's quite a few people that have a similar responses when I think you responded to it as well. It was a tweet saying like, how does it feel to have a game that will act as this generation's sort of Quake or Blood in the way that those games inspired you? Is that a weird, surreal moment to have somebody say, like, because I only played Quake recently as well, so Dusk was my first iteration to that, and it's funny when I go to play Blood now, I'm like, oh, this is a lot like Dusk, and it's like they're meant to be the other way around. But does it feel surreal to you when people say that to you, that game kind of has that similar impact that those games had to you?
Yeah, very surreal. It's really cool. That's kind of been something I've dreamed about for years, of being able to make something that would mean that to somebody else. So it's really cool to hear that. But it is also really weird. A lot about stuff that's happened in the wake of Dusk is really weird. Because in a weird way, once you've had a successful game and you're a little bit behind the scenes with stuff, I'm not that good at paying attention, but it's like, I see behind the scenes stuff now just by virtue of being with New Blood, and and there's a sense in which everything becomes the magic gets stripped away in a way, because it happens first of all when you're designing a game like these games you emulate, or like these games you love. As a developer, you have to start thinking critically about things that as a player you would just accept and be happy with. Like, I now have thought quite a bit and talked quite a bit to people about what parts of Doom suck. Like, what levels in Doom are terrible, or what parts of Doom were just a bad idea, because you have to when you're making a game like that, and you want to make something that is going to hold up. And I'm not saying that Doom doesn't hold up in this day and age, but you're making a game decades later, and so you have to learn from like, well, what do these things mean in this day and age? Back when Doom was released, Doom was a horror game. This day and age, Doom is a crazy ego shooter. This stuff changed, so you have to engage with these games in a really critical, like picking them apart way, which in a lot of ways does take the magic out. And the same goes for just kind of seeing what life actually looks like once you've had a successful game, and the fact that I've said before to people, it's like I worked on Dusk essentially like it was going to be the last game I ever made. Like it, and what actually happens is you release a game like Dusk, it does super well, which is awesome. You have income from that now, which is awesome. Your life is forever changed, but you still wake up a few weeks later and you're still the same person, and you still have the same worries and the same desire to create things, and now you're just in a completely different world because you're not an unknown person. You are the guy who made Dusk and all of this stuff. And you learn about some of the people behind the scenes of older games that you liked, newer games that you might like, and sometimes you learn that what happened behind the scenes is just not that great, and it's not what you imagined, or sometimes the people are not that great and not what you imagined. This is not about anyone at New Blood, by the way. This is
just drop all their names, David. Do
it. Yeah. It's like there's a sense in which it levels everything out. Suddenly, like John Romero is someone I have always idolized as a developer, and I still have a lot of respect for him. But he's just a guy. He's a very talented guy, but it's like when you get so you've kind of I don't want to say I've done the thing John Romero has, because obviously I haven't, because I'm not an ultra gazillionaire having made one of the most influential PC games of all time. But, you've kind of walked that same path, designing a similar game. You've had it work well. You have some, you start to see people being like, oh, this is better than, this in Doom, or this is worse than this in Doom. I don't know. It just sort of levels everything. You just get to the point where you feel like there's... There's not. It's not that there aren't people you can look up to or games you can look up to, but you feel like there's. We're all kind of just going along, trying to do our best, and trying to make games that people will like. And there isn't actually this real distinction between the god tier games and everything underneath that we think there is.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of that makes any sense, but...
No, it definitely does, because it brings up an interesting point then, because obviously, I think with regards to, you listen to maybe content creators or you listen to developers, whether it's games or not, one of the big things that always comes up is if once they get that level of eyes on them or the attention on them, it's kind of like, okay, well, what's next? Like, a lot of there's some big, YouTube names that will have made like one fantastic video and it'll get like 2-3 million views or whatever, and then after that they'll get maybe 10,000, 20,000 views. And granted, it's still more than what they were getting initially, but it's nowhere near the heights that went. Do you kind of, obviously you haven't released a fully fledged title since Dusk. You're working on quite a few things. Do you feel a sense of pressure to, maybe more specifically I want to touch on is Gloomwood, because whilst it's not solely your project and Dylan is doing a lot of the work on that, you're also helping out on it. Is there a strange sense of, okay, well, this needs to do as well as Dusk did, in your mind at least, or is it not even to a great extent, but even just a little bit at the back of your mind thinking, oh, if this isn't as good as Dusk, or at least it doesn't perform as well as Dusk, I'm not going to be happy with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't say I feel that really with Gloomwood. I think because it's Dylan's game. I'm a co-developer on it, but it's like it's his vision, and there's other people involved doing other aspects of it too. Dusk was basically just me, like Dave. Dave was obviously producing it. Andrew did music for it. New Blood, like their Dusk World, was worked on a lot by like New Blood QA guys and stuff. So it wasn't all just me, but like the majority of the single player portion of that game was just me doing it. No contracted art, no contracted assets, anything like that, just me. Gloomwood is a very different story. We're contracting out some stuff. We, have other people at New Blood who are like, oh, I can do this. And, it's more of a group effort. So there's less of a sense of personal responsibility in a way. Not that it's like, I don't care if this game does well, but it's like you feel for me, there's this sense of security with everyone working on it. Not just that I feel like we're all kind of checking each other and make sure the game's the best it can be, but also that when this comes out, it's a Dylan Rogers game that a lot of other people at New Blood worked on that I am just helping to co-develop. But I do feel that pressure with basically anything else I do. Dusk was a huge undertaking, and it may not seem like it playing it, because, there's a lot of other games that are similar to Dusk, but doing all that myself, starting from a point of not really knowing how to do a lot of that stuff, was a just massive effort that really took a toll on me at the very end. And I'm still not ready to jump back into doing something of that scope. So most of the stuff that I've been working on since Dusk is little stuff. There's the Dread X things. There's some unreleased stuff. It's all little games. But the problem is that I still feel that pressure to, to meet the bar that I set for myself with Dusk. And I have not yet figured out how to kind of quell that neuroses. It's something I'm still working on, figuring out how to continue to be a developer in the wake of Dusk.
Yeah. Do you find even, with the smaller projects you've done, like you mentioned DreadX, and obviously you did I suppose a larger role in The Hunt, was there a bit of sort of an expectation even that you were putting on yourself? It's like, okay, well, this is a game that now features, some people will see like your name, particularly yours in Airdorf. When I saw the first collection, I was like, oh, I'm interested in this. Do you feel that sense of, is it almost like, as you mentioned, the expectation, is it a good expectation to have it in some cases, or how do you find the balances when it comes to dealing with it in some cases?
It definitely makes me feel a lot of pressure. It's a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand, being able to just put my name on a thing and know that that's going to help sell it to people is a very powerful tool. I was that was a big part of my involvement in The Hunt. Was just like, I can, it's not just that I'm there producing the games and helping and doing that. It's also the fact that it's just my name can be on it, and that's a boon. And that's kind of a crazy power to have, even in whatever small amount that small niche community that I have that. But then on the other hand, it's like I do, with everything I'm working on, I'm like, oh, but people are, what if someone plays this and they're like, the guy who made Dusk did this crap? Oh, they've must have been a one-hit wonder or whatever. And the crazy thing is, I've never had anyone say that. I mean, maybe there were some passing reviews for like Squirrel Stapler kind of got some polarizing reviews. There may have been some where they were like, I can't believe the guy of Dusk made that. I can't remember. But like, no one really externally is putting that pressure on. In fact, quite the opposite. I have a lot of people being like, no, well, I'll just play anything you make. I don't care if it's small or weird or whatever. So, fans are not putting that pressure on me. It's me putting that pressure on me. Getting too wrapped up in like, oh, what is my career now going to look like, instead of what's really important, which is, what is this next game going to look like? Making a good game at whatever scope or whatever type you happen to be working on at that point.
No sign of a Squirrel Stapler 2, maybe?
No. Before there's a Squirrel Stapler 2, I would want to have a standalone release. And there's also a little spin-off game based on Squirrel Stapler that I want to do someday that I think people would find pretty funny.
Yeah, for sure. I've kind of one last question on Dusk, and then we'll move on a bit more to DreadX, and then to finally the projects you've coming up. But obviously you mentioned earlier Andrew Holschult does he does all of the music for the game, which is a fantastic score. And
not
I think
quite all.
Well,
there's one track that I did.
Oh, okay.
But
which one?
Yeah. The ambient track that plays in the very final level at the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting.
I made a point of wanting to do that as like a send off to the game.
Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, sorry.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
All other 100 tracks or whatever Andrew did.
But it's it's interesting, because one of my questions was going to be like, did you ever think you wanted to do the music for Dusk when you're doing it?
Yeah,
I imagine
that was the plan originally.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, even after New Blood picked it up, I'm like, no, I'm doing the music. Dave brought up, he's like, hey, Holschult would like to do the maybe, and like, I don't think the Rise of the Triad soundtrack is the best thing Andrew's done. I think is so. I was like, who's Andrew? No, I'm doing the music. I'm a composer. I know what I want it to sound like. I'm doing it. And then Andrew, Dave contacted him anyway. He was probably like, oh, can I contact him anyway? And I was like, oh, sure, whatever. And he did a demo, and I got to thinking, I was like, well, Okay, I'm making a boomer shooter. I know what everyone wants. They want the Quake 2 soundtrack. They want heavy metal for it. I am not going to write that, because I guess I am kind of a heavy metal musician now in a weird way, but at that time I was not, I didn't even have the ability to make anything like that. So I was like, maybe he'll do the action tracks and I'll do the ambience, and because he sent in a demo and I'm like, I like this. This would work really well. And I brought that idea up to him, and he was basically like, "No, like no, either I'm doing everything or I'm not doing it." And I was like, "Okay, you know what? I have so many other tasks I'm going to be doing on this stupid thing. Sure, we'll just do that." And that ended up being a very good decision, especially with the sort of game that Dusk ended up becoming, which was much more fitting with like Andrew's style of music than it would have fit in with what I was gonna do.
Was the demo track he sent you, was it anything that we'd be familiar with from the final product, or was it completely scrapped and changed?
Not that I recall. I don't think it made it in at all. There are several tracks that he did that didn't make it into the final game in any form. He's just incredibly prolific when it comes to writing tracks. So he'd write several bespoke tracks for a thing that's like will never be used again or whatever. Like, Andrew, we could reuse it. No, it's not good enough. I'm doing a new thing. Okay, all right, it's up to you.
Yeah, and then obviously with the benefit of hindsight, looking back on Dusk now, obviously it's immensely popular, and out of your way you could say that there's nothing you change, but is there anything that you would change if you were given the opportunity?
Yes, everything. No, nothing about how so no, I wouldn't actually change anything. If someone like gave me a time machine, I would, it was like, you can go back and change stuff about Dusk. I wouldn't do that because no, Dusk did great and everyone loves it. So why would I change anything? But thinking back, I'm very self-critical, and I have a hard time not just seeing the flaws in things I've done, and that includes Dusk, where it's like there are so many flaws in that, or things that I could do better now with the knowledge I gained from making Dusk. But ultimately, no, I wouldn't change anything, because it was, people love it. It did really well. That's about, really, as a creator, that's the only thing you can ask for, because asking for you to be eternally satisfied with it being perfect is just not going to happen, because what's going to, like, whatever you make, it could have the entire world saying it's like the greatest game ever made, and in a few years you're going to look back on it and be like, wow, this is a piece of crap. Why did I think that it could? That's just part of the deal.
If we move on a little bit then to the smaller collaborative projects you've done after Dusk, we look at the first Dread X collection, which I actually think is a fantastic, the Pony Factory, which is the game you worked on for that collection. I think is a really nice blend of both of your styles. It has the first person shooter aspects of Dusk, but it also has the sort of slower movement and more methodical sort of storytelling of, say, the likes of the Moonsliver or the Music Machine. Was obviously I've spoken to Ted about a little bit about the lore and the little aspects that he likes to put in story wise into those games. How much of the collaborative process for that first game was there with regards to the story you're telling in your game is going to impact this sort of greater sort of Dread X universe?
So that was actually that wasn't it. There was no plan at all. Ted kind of got the games and then figured out a way to write them together, or write them into the overarching narrative. Pony Factory was like, I had no guidance or input from him on the story at all. It was just my own weird. It was actually originally going to be something a lot more kind of generic and just sort of misty and floaty. It was just going to be like, oh, you're going to this weird, surreal industrial place filled with horrors, and I forget exactly how the idea for it being like ponies came about, but the decision was kind of that, like, no, I want to put some of my sense of humor in this, because I have a very weird sense of humor, which I'm sure is evident by Squirrel Stapler, and that would show up in Dusk, and it would like make things scarier for people. So like the horrors are a great example, where the horrors, I designed them to be kind of like goofy looking. They were supposed to be unsettling but goofy looking, and the fact that I made them, you know, look weird and goofy made them more frightening to a lot of people. And that's something I kind of ran with in the Dread X projects, where I was like, maybe if I, you know, maybe my sense of humor is twisted enough, if I make something that I think is funny and then just twist it a little way toward being scary, for other people that'll parse as just like really grotesque and scary. So then, you know, the idea of making it a black and white game set in an industrial setting, and having it be an FPS was all in place. And then I was like, how about it's about like magical ponies, and they're just called magical ponies. But what the, you know, the game never makes any mention of them being like horrible hell monsters. It's like, nope, they're magic ponies, and they're actually these horrible flesh beasts.
Yeah. It's actually really interesting, because I feel like, at least with your collaboration then later on for the hunt with Dread XP, it actually works probably a little bit more into the style of horror you usually do, because, you know, Dread XP, at least now I'm going to try my very best to like recall on what the branding is very much positively spooky, so it's not extreme horror like a lot of horror titles, okay, but it's almost like a horror light. I think Spookware is a very good example of that. Like, that is not a scary game, but it is a spooky game, for lack of a better word, you know. So did you find that with the hunt it was a little bit less, more horror oriented and more so spooky, with a bit of an overarching story? Very much so is really the case with the hunt, isn't it?
Well, I don't know how much I want to really talk about it, but there were people behind the scenes that there were some differing opinions about certain games in that collection, that that there were not really fights, but there were arguments about some games being too grotesque, and I fought for keeping them like that, and there were other people who wanted to fight to have them be less so, and in the end there was sort of a compromise. Similar case with Scroll Stapler, actually, although I didn't know that was happening at the time, but there was some pushback against the concept for that, for obvious reasons. For the story part of Dread X, I was actually basically entirely uninvolved with that. That is all. That's all. That's Ted's baby. The plot. I don't even know most of the plot, to be honest. I knew parts of it that were relevant to creating the launcher and creating that. Like, I knew all the relevant story beats that would happen in the launcher, but as far as the whole lore and everything, I actually that's not my field at all. I was just involved basically in producing the individual games, and kind of designing the overall concept for what they would all be. And, you know, going in and like testing them and making suggestions for how they would improve, and deciding, you know, getting them all to kind of fit together and fit different roles in the collection.
When this is a really awful question to ask someone, but, you know, when it comes to, like, obviously you're looking at all the games, you're providing some oversight on all of them for the hunt. Do you have a favorite? it's almost a very terrible question to ask.
I do, yeah. I don't think that I have one that I would like go and say like, this is the one that's better than all the others, because I think they're all filling different roles. But my personal favorite is definitely Uktana.
Oh yeah.
Because that's the one that I am just so mad that I didn't make. It's just so much about it is like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. This is exactly what I would want to do as a developer. You know, it's got that Kira sense of humor, which is also very twisted. So when I'd be testing things and I would just be like bursting out laughing at some of the things. I'm like, you are like you are a lunatic. What is wrong with you? Of course, that also has a Scroll Stapler reference in it, which it's a hunting horror game like Scroll Stapler. In a lot of ways, I think it's actually a more successful hunting horror game because he he focused on stuff that makes more sense for a smaller bite-sized horror hunting game, whereas with Scroll Stapler I was like trying to make an actual hunting game, and didn't work for everybody.
No, yeah, it's definitely it's an acquired taste. I think that some of the games in Dread X, I know particularly the Hunt is, I think, probably the most polished collection. I really enjoy it, and you'd expect the most recent one out of those collections to be the most polished. Now, Spookware is on a completely different level, and it's a fantastic game in its own right. You know, do you think of, like, when you first went into the first collection, were you like, could you envisage what the fourth collection would be then, or was it kind of like, oh, here's a job, I can do something small on the side?
Yeah, it was essentially that. It was just like, oh, okay, the combination, I'm not hurting for money. I have DUSK income that still basically pays the bills. Not basically pays the bills, it does pay the bills. But I am also aware that the industry that I work in is unpredictable, and so the more income streams, the better. So when Erdorf actually is the one who introduced me, it was like, hey, I'm doing this thing, and it's a paid-for game jam, and I'm like, okay, I'm interested in that. Because you're going to get paid and you're going to get royalties, and it's like a week of work, and you also have another game that you can sell forever, or that DreadX can sell forever and then pay you for, which was very attractive to me because, like I said, I want as many income streams as possible. So that was all that was, as I was just like, okay, cool, I knew Ted's vision for stuff, and figured maybe there'd be future opportunities, and it turns out there were future opportunities. Very near future opportunities. But no, I was never like, oh, I want to try and direct one of these collections at some point, or anything. It was just, I'm like, okay, cool, let's do this. And then when the second one came around, I'm like, okay, sure, I've got another one in me. And then when the third one came around, I was like, I do not have another one in me. And fourth one came around, I'm like, I still don't have another one in me, but I will gladly direct it.
I can't remember, was it your brother John, did he work on the second one, or was it the third one?
Yeah, he worked on the second one also.
Yeah. I want to draw on something you mentioned.
A game that I still have not played. I really need to do that.
Yeah. Oh no, for sure. It's very much worth the time. I should have mentioned at the beginning, you are the second Szymanski that has come on this podcast, because I have spoken to John on here before. So I have spoken to him in length about that already. So it's a perfect, and I can plug that episode and let people go and find that one. When it comes to something you mentioned earlier, which was about, the gaming market being very unpredictable, I think for a while, at least, there's a lot of people kind of sensing that the boomer shooter genre, despite, Realms Deep had about 120 games at it this year, that it is kind of, it's past its peak, and it's kind of coming to that stage where maybe it's starting to slow down a bit. And, the games you're working on now for the future-wise, you're co-developing Gloomwood, DUSK 82, Rats for Breakfast, which is obviously on the back burner, but still one that will come out at some stage. Is that a conscious decision not to make another boomer shooter-style game and focus on something else to try and see where the market goes then in a few years' time?
Yeah, I think the thing that's important to remember is that even though we kind of look at it as a zeitgeist, the whole boomer shooter niche is a niche. Like, if I guess, DUSK is really the most successful one of at least the indie ones. And it's, it's done super well, but you also have to remember that it's like, that is the most successful one, I think by a lot, actually, which is weird. And if you think of other genres, other like bigger indie genres, and think of the most successful entries in them, we're talking many, many, many more sales than DUSK has gotten. This is a niche market. Now, it doesn't mean you can't make a game for it, and it doesn't mean you can't make money making games for it, but it's important to look at, like, the saturation compared with the potential players and also other competing products. And the fact of the matter is that I think we pretty much reached saturation for boomer shooters. Again, doesn't mean you shouldn't make them, especially if you're someone who has a day job and you're just doing it because you want to make a cool game. Like, absolutely go for it. But I think we've definitely reached the peak of, like, being able to make a boomer shooter and have it, like, do super well guaranteed, if that makes sense. Not that there was ever a guarantee, but, like, I think this is when we're unfortunately going to start to get people who are releasing these games hoping to do, new blood numbers, and it's not going to happen. And I think it's very important, if you are someone who is making a boomer shooter right now, not to stop making it, but just to adjust expectations and plan accordingly. Yeah. Which is that, this is a niche zeitgeist that is probably passing because of saturation. And while I think it's going to be a genre that'll remain around and hopefully will continue to be developed on and released for, look at it as what it is, which is a niche genre and not a guaranteed hit. And so, yeah, coming off of Dusk, I didn't even want to work on another one because I just spent like 3 years, focusing my entire life on working on one, and I wanted to do something else. And I've done a bunch of different prototypes that have like intermingled and all this stuff, and none of them have been boomer shooters. The closest thing I've done to another boomer shooter would probably be the Pony Factory, which isn't really a boomer shooter. And yeah, I have other interests. I have, like, Rats for Breakfast is kind of a bit of a return to the horror game, like the narrative-driven horror game thing. Although there was some mechanical twists to it, which the reason that's shelved right now is actually just because I kind of designed myself into a corner with it, and I'm not quite sure how to progress. So that will probably be shelved for a while. I intend to release it at some point because I don't like wasting work, but I need to figure out how to refactor it into a game that's going to work. There's a couple other things I've been working on that are all a little more in that direction. There's a melee based horror action game, kind of like Condemned, that I've teased for a while. That also I've hit some design troubles with. So, sensing a recurring theme here. But yeah, basically what I'm doing right now, in addition to working on Gloomwood, is just doing smaller stuff that appeals to me, that I want to work on. And I intend to be a game developer for a very long time. Like, I intend this to be a long-term career. And because it's a marathon and not a sprint, I want to pace myself and not burn myself out. And I think part of pacing myself, I don't know about other devs, but for me, part of it is taking some time to just make stuff that you want to make that may not be the next Dusk. Now, all that being said, I don't think I'm going to be able to, like, go through the rest of my life without making another boomer shooter. I think Dusk 2 has to happen someday, although it's going to be a much different development environment than Dusk 1 was. But aside from that, like, I love those sort of games, and I still love them. Like, and, I'll play them for a while, and then I'll kind of be like, okay, I want to move on to playing something else, and then a year or two will go by, and I'll get right back into them. Like, and oftentimes it'll be, like, the same game that I've played since I was a teenager. Like, Quake. I got way back into playing Quake with this new port. I've played Quake, 1,000 times, but then going in, it's like, oh, hey, new episode. I can play the expansions, which I've never played. And it's still a blast. It's still just as fun as it ever was, maybe even more, because I'm, like, older now and I appreciate it more. And I don't think it's possible that I'm going to not ever make something like that again. But when I do, it's either going to be, again, with that knowledge that what I'm making is a niche product and it'll be small in scale, or it's going to be, a bigger team effort probably.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so we'll just see what happens. For now, I forgot to even mention DUSK 82. DUSK 82, I actually just finished. We just finished submitting the build for Switch, so that's the Switch version, at least, of that is done, and there'll be a PC version coming out with even more features at some point. And yeah, so my plan right now is basically to just keep content going, keep making stuff. One of my idols in game development is a man named Jeff Vogel, who is who's the CEO of Spiderweb Software. And when I say CEO, what I really mean is he is one of two people who work at Spiderweb Software. And they have been making essentially the same sort of indie RPG since the 90s, I think. When was the first Exile? He's been doing it for 40 years at this point. Which is longer than basically any other indie developer I've ever heard of. This is before people even knew what indie was. This is before there was any indie, because all it was just like, because everyone was indie, like, so he's one of my game dev idols, and his approach to game development is very long term. Essentially, he, when he makes something, he plans on selling that thing basically for the rest of his life in different forms. And that's kind of how I look at it. It's like, anything that I do, I want to be able to sell that, down the road in some form. Maybe it's never going to do DUSK numbers, but like, the Moon Sliver, for instance, I'm working at getting that ported to Switch right now. And, all of this stuff I intend to be sort of a long-term investment.
So the Skyrim model for all future David Szymanski games.
Kind of. Hopefully not so that it becomes a meme, but, like, people want to buy old games. Just look at Quake. The Quake port comes out. It's not even a remaster or a remake. It's just a port. And suddenly, all these people who have played Quake before and bought Quake before are buying Quake again and playing it and enjoying it. And still has value. Same with, like, Myst. How many times has Myst been remade? I think it's like 4 now. 4 times they've remade Myst. I own every one of those. I just bought the new one and played through Myst again. And Myst is a freaking puzzle game. It's not even Quake. It's not even something you can replay. But yet, people are still replaying it, So, yeah, people are very happy, at least right now. I hope, the industry can change. Everything's going live service. Everything's going like the Netflix of X. We've been very, very fortunate to avoid that so far, but that'll probably come someday. It's going to make life hard for all of us. And maybe, maybe it'll change and people will not want to. You never know how the industry is going to go, but at least for right now, people like buying old games.
Yeah. I have 2 questions, and the one I'm about to ask now is a complete tonal shift as to what we've been talking about so far. This was complete last minute, so judge me for all you want. Who would win in a fight between Dusk Dude and Long Dick Johnson?
Probably Long Dick Johnson, because he has a fucking long dick. Oh Lord, I can't believe that's my that's my legacy on social media. I can believe it, actually. That's very believable.
That and the Doom 3 shotgun, I think, is what people know you for on Twitter. I think I saw a tweet recently. It was like you submitted that picture of like the Long Dick Johnson thing to some account, and they were like,
I like stirring the pot sometimes.
Yeah, and like
some people get like legitimately mad at me for that, and they're like, why do you keep bringing this up if you're mad that people are like, no, you don't get it. Like, the joke is that I keep bringing it up. That's the punchline. That I said a stupid thing and got a bunch of people yelling at me, and then I'm like, whipping myself by bringing it up again so people can keep making fun of me.
The other question I want to ask, it's one I like to ask all my guests, because usually in the case of games journalism or in game development, very rarely will we get a chance to actually play games. So I was wondering, are you playing anything at the moment, and if so, what?
Yeah. So I got on a point and click adventure kick again recently. I played through, finally after all these years, I played through Quarn, which was, guess you could call it the Dusk of Mist-likes. It was sort of that idea of like it's the modern indie, throwback to games like Myst and stuff. Played through that, and it's awesome. Played through the Myst remake in VR, which was actually pretty great. I'm surprised how much of that game I've forgotten over the years, and that plus the puzzle randomization made it almost a completely fresh experience, which is awesome. Enjoyed that and decided I was still going strong, so I decided to move on to Riven, which is a game that I certainly played before as a kid and throughout my life, but I'd never actually beaten and had forgotten almost everything about, so I played through Riven. Phenomenal. And then I finished up Riven just about in time for Deathloop to come out. And so now I've been playing Deathloop. I survived the tutorial. It took everything I had to keep playing through the tutorial because, oh my goodness, that is one of the longest tutorial sections I have ever seen in a first-person shooter. It took me like 3 hours to get through the tutorial, and it's such a tutorial-y tutorial, and it just hurt, but you get out of the tutorial, and then it is an Arcane game, and Arcane never misses, and it's really fun. So I've been playing that right now, and then after that, I don't know, I forgot to mention, I also, over the last few months, I played through Metal Gear Solid 1 through 3, and I'd never played those games before, and those are amazing games. They are completely out of their mind. So yeah, I've actually played quite a bit. Oh yeah, and I forgot Quake. Quake, I played through the...
You're playing a lot more than I thought you were going to say. You played more than me, so...
Well, I'm very lucky in that... Well, I'm self-employed. I'm not really working full-time right now. DUSK is still paying the bills, so I have the leisure to be able to work basically part-time hours on stuff. And in the evenings, my wife and I are both kind of we like just doing our own thing. So a lot of the time in the evening, I just have free for playing games. And so I do that, in addition to watching, movies like Karis Hell on Amazon Prime.
Oh yeah, no, that's amazing. I didn't realize that you had even touched Deathloop yet, but I've been giving it a go myself, and it's my first. Oh well, no, I suppose I played a little bit of Prey, but it's my first proper delving into an Arcane game as well. So,
they're so cool, but they're so very. There is a very specific approach they have to immersive sims, with very specific strengths and very specific weaknesses. They are like the absolute kings when it comes to emergent systemic interaction. I don't think any other immersive sim comes close. And then there are other areas I'd say they're weak in, but if you're somebody who really gets a lot of enjoyment out of systems and emergent gameplay, it's like they're one of the best developers out there for that.
I think for sure, at least with Deathloop, it almost feels like this is their magnum opus of all their previous games, at least from what I've heard, like the elements that are inspired by like Dishonored. Prey was obviously a big leap for them. I think Prey is extremely underrated, which is unfortunate that it didn't sell well.
I think Prey is kind of, at least I'll have to play more of Deathloop, but I think Prey remains their peak as far as complexity and the attention to the details of all that stuff. Prey's an insanely complex game for what it is. You get to see even a little more of that interacting in Moon Crash, which is basically Deathloop but in the Prey universe, and is incredibly good. I think Deathloop they definitely refined out some things. Well, I mean, not refined out, but there was definitely some stuff where it's like, okay, this game's a little more focused on action. Prey's just nuts, like you have Mimic in Prey, which you can solve all sorts of puzzles in stupid ways with Mimic, where it's like, oh, how do I get into this room to press this button? Wait, if I turn into a coffee cup, I can just go under this slot and go into... A lot of that is not in Deathloop, because Deathloop is very focused on being like a
Bond sort of game.
Kind of like Dishonored with guns in a way.
Yeah.
It's the core gameplay loop where it's very, action-y, ninja-y, but without the stupid chaos system, which is awesome in my opinion.
For sure. Finally, I want to throw it up to you. You've been so gracious in your time, and I think we've gone over what I had initially said, and I apologize if I've kept you too long.
It always happens with me, because I talk so much. It always goes over the time. That's just expected.
Where can, I suppose, people listening, I'm sure everyone who's listening has already played your fantastic titles, but on the off chance that somebody has stumbled across this video or podcast episode, where can they kind of find you, and where can they find your games?
So the nexus of all my stuff is basically Twitter. I'm at DuskDev. You can follow me on Twitter if you want really a lot of shit posting and not very much about actual game development. And there are links to all of my other disparate various things on Twitter. I do music. I do photography sometimes. It's crappy photography, but it brings me joy. If you're just interested in my games, you can find me on Steam. Really, if you just type in David Szymanski, you'll come up with stuff. I have a creator page that has all my stuff on there. If you're interested in other New Blood games which follow in the vein of Dusk, you can find some other New Blood games like Ultra Kill is the most recent one that is blowing up and everyone loves it. And of course, I'm working on Gloomwood with Dylan Rogers, who I think is at Taffer King on Twitter. And that's about all I can think of to shill.
Well, I appreciate it anyways, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, David. There's been some amazing insight in this episode, so I suppose I look forward to seeing the release of Gloomwood and all the plethora of titles that once you get back to, I'm sure we'll see I'm sure we still have yet to see the peak of what David Szymanski is capable of yet. So,
I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks a million, David.